What made the Nephilim so dangerous? It wasn't just their size. It wasn't just their strength. According to ancient texts, it was something far more unsettling. Because if the stories are true, the Nephilim were not just giants. They were something humanity had never seen before. Something that didn't fully belong to this world. Long before the rise of the first civilizations, before kingdoms, before empires, before history as we know it even began, there are records that describe a very different version of Earth. A world where humanity was not alone at the top. In ancient writings, the Nephilim are described as beings of immense power, born from the union between the Watchers and human women. This origin alone set them apart from everything else on Earth. They were not fully human, and they were not fully divine. They existed somewhere in between, and that may have been the first reason they were so dangerous, because they broke the natural order. In many ancient traditions, there is an idea that the world was created with a certain balance. Humans had their place, the divine had its place, but the Nephilim did not fit into that structure. They were something new, something unpredictable, and according to some interpretations, something unstable. But what truly made them dangerous wasn't just what they were, it was what they could do. Ancient texts suggest that the Nephilim possessed incredible physical power. They were described as giants, towering over ordinary humans, capable of feats that would have been impossible for anyone else. Imagine a world where a small number of beings were physically superior to everyone else, stronger, faster, more resilient. In such a world, control would not be difficult. Power would not need to be negotiated. It could simply be taken. Some interpretations of ancient texts suggest that the Nephilim did not just exist among humans. They dominated them, not necessarily through organized empires as we understand them today, but through sheer presence. Their size alone would have made them intimidating. Their strength would have made resistance nearly impossible. But even that may not have been the most dangerous thing about them, because physical power alone does not change the course of history. Knowledge does. And according to ancient traditions, the Nephilim, and those connected to them, introduced knowledge that humanity was not ready to handle. Knowledge of weapons, knowledge of warfare, knowledge of how to manipulate the natural world. In some accounts, early humans were taught things that allowed them to reshape their environment, but also to destroy each other more effectively. If this is true, it means the Nephilim did not just dominate through strength. They changed the trajectory of human civilization itself. They accelerated it, but in a direction that may not have been stable, because when power and knowledge grow too quickly, without balance, the result is often chaos. And some ancient texts describe exactly that. A world becoming increasingly violent, a world where corruption spread, a world where the line between order and disorder began to disappear. If the Nephilim played a role in that transformation, then their danger was not just physical, it was systemic. They may have altered the entire structure of early human society, and once that kind of change begins, it is very difficult to reverse. But there is one detail that makes this story even more unsettling. Some interpretations suggest that the Nephilim were not just powerful, they were insatiable. Not just in terms of influence or control, but in ways that hint at something far darker. Because if the ancient descriptions are taken seriously, the Nephilim did not simply coexist with humanity. They consumed resources at a scale that the world may not have been able to sustain. Some traditions even suggest that their presence led to imbalance in the natural order itself. A world pushed beyond its limits. A system under pressure. And when a system reaches that point, collapse becomes inevitable. So what made the Nephilim so dangerous? It wasn't just their size. It wasn't just their strength. It was the combination of everything. Their origin, their power, their knowledge, and their impact on the world around them. But if that was true, then it raises an even more disturbing question. If the Nephilim were truly that dangerous, why were they allowed to exist at all? And more importantly, what finally stopped them? Because according to ancient traditions, something did. And whatever it was, it didn't just remove the Nephilim, it changed the entire world. If the Nephilim were as powerful as ancient texts suggest, then their existence would not have gone unnoticed. And according to those same traditions, it didn't. Because something began to change. At first, it may not have been obvious. Small shifts in behavior, rising tension, a growing sense that the world was no longer balanced. But over time, the changes became impossible to ignore. Ancient descriptions begin to paint a picture of a world descending into chaos. Violence increased, conflicts became more frequent, and whatever order once existed began to break apart. If the Nephilim truly possessed superior strength and knowledge, their influence would not have remained isolated. It would have spread. And as it spread, so did its consequences. Because power, when left unchecked, does not remain stable. It expands, it consumes, and eventually, it destabilizes everything around it. Some interpretations suggest that the Nephilim didn't just dominate physically, they influenced human behavior itself. They may have introduced ways of thinking, ways of fighting, and ways of controlling that humanity had never experienced before. And once those ideas were introduced, there was no way to contain them. Humanity began to change, not gradually, but rapidly, too rapidly. Societies became more aggressive, conflicts escalated faster, and the balance that once defined the world before civilizations began started to collapse. In some ancient accounts, the world before the flood is described as being filled with corruption. Not just moral corruption, but systemic corruption, a breakdown of order at every level. And if the Nephilim were part of that transformation, then their danger was no longer limited to their physical presence. They had become a catalyst, a force that accelerated the decline of the entire world. But there is something even more unsettling hidden within these descriptions. Some traditions suggest that the Nephilim were not self-sustaining, that their existence placed enormous strain on the world around them. Resources became scarce, systems became unstable, and the natural balance that once allowed life to function began to fail. Imagine a world where a small group of beings consumes far more than the environment can support, where their presence alone begins to push the system beyond its limits. At first, the effects might be subtle, but over time, the system starts to break, and once it reaches that point, collapse becomes inevitable. This idea appears in multiple interpretations of ancient texts. A world pushed too far, a world no longer capable of sustaining itself. And at the center of it all, the Nephilim. But here's where the story becomes even more intense. Because according to some interpretations, the problem was not just what the Nephilim were doing, it was what they represented. They were a violation of the natural order, a crossing of boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. And once that boundary was broken, the consequences were not contained. They spread across the world, through humanity, through society itself. And when a system is corrupted at that level, there are only two possible outcomes: total collapse or total reset. This is where many ancient traditions begin to converge on a single idea, that the world, as it existed at that time, could not continue. Something had to change, not gradually, but completely, because whatever was happening had reached a point of no return. The violence, the imbalance, the instability, it had all built up to something massive, something unavoidable. And if the Nephilim were at the center of that collapse, then removing them would not have been a small event. It would have required something on a global scale, something powerful enough to erase not just a species, but an entire world. And according to ancient traditions, that is exactly what happened. But that raises a question that changes everything. If the Nephilim were truly that dangerous, if their existence pushed the world to the brink, then what was powerful enough to stop them? And more importantly, did it destroy everything? Or did something survive? Because if even a small part of that world remained, then the story of the Nephilim may not be over. If the world had truly reached a point of no return, then what came next would not have been a correction. It would have been a reset. Ancient traditions from different cultures describe a moment when everything changed. A moment when the world that once existed was suddenly gone. Not slowly, not gradually, but violently. According to biblical accounts, this event is known as the flood, a catastrophe so massive that it reshaped the entire surface of the earth. But what if the flood wasn't just a natural disaster? What if it was a response, a direct reaction to what the world had become? Because if the Nephilim were as dangerous as the texts suggest, then removing them would not have been simple. It would have required something capable of reaching every corner of the world, something unavoidable, something final. And that is exactly how the flood is described. Water rising across the entire earth, land disappearing beneath the surface, civilizations erased, structures destroyed, and everything that existed before wiped away. If the Nephilim were part of that world, then they would have faced the same fate. Or would they? Because this is where the story becomes even more unsettling. Some interpretations suggest that not everything was destroyed, that while the flood may have ended the age of giants, it may not have erased them completely. There are ancient accounts that mention giants appearing again after the flood, not in the same numbers, not with the same dominance, but still present, still remembered, still feared. How is that possible? If the flood was meant to reset the world, how could anything from before it survive? There are only a few possibilities. Either the stories were symbolic, or something remained. Some theories suggest that remnants of the Nephilim bloodline continued through survivors. Others propose that similar events happened again, that the boundary between worlds was crossed more than once. And then there is another possibility, one that is rarely discussed. What if some of the Nephilim were never destroyed at all? What if the flood didn't reach everything? Ancient texts often leave gaps. Details are missing. Events are described but not fully explained. And within those gaps, possibilities begin to emerge. Because if even a small number of these beings survived, then the danger they represented would not have disappeared. It would have been reduced, hidden, but not gone. This idea may explain something else that has puzzled historians for centuries. Why do stories of giants continue to appear in cultures that developed after the flood? If the giants were completely erased, why do the stories persist? Why do so many civilizations, separated by time and geography, continue to describe encounters with beings far larger than normal humans? In some cases, these giants are portrayed as enemies, in others, as rulers, and in some traditions, as remnants of a much older world that once existed before everything changed. But even more intriguing is what happens after these stories appear. In many cases, the giants disappear again, almost as if they are being removed from history, over and over. And that brings us back to a disturbing possibility. What if the Nephilim were not just dangerous because of what they did in the past, but because of what they represent? A force that disrupts order, a presence that destabilizes systems, something that, if allowed to grow unchecked, could push the world back into the same kind of collapse that once required a global reset. If that were true, then the flood was not just destruction, it was containment. But if it was containment, then the question becomes unavoidable. Was it permanent, or was it only temporary? Because if history has shown anything, it's that things we believe are gone sometimes aren't. If the flood was meant to end the age of the Nephilim, then why does the question still exist today? Why are we still talking about them? Because something doesn't fully add up. If a global catastrophe erased an entire world, if it wiped out civilizations, structures, and beings powerful enough to dominate humanity, then why do traces of that world seem to keep resurfacing? Why do stories of giants continue to appear long after they were supposed to be gone? And more importantly, why do some discoveries seem to suggest that something was found and then quietly removed? Because when we look back at the reports of giant skeletons discovered in the last few centuries, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Findings are reported, evidence is described, attention grows, and then silence. The remains are taken, the records become unclear, and over time, the story disappears, almost as if it was never meant to stay in the public eye. But here's where the idea becomes even more unsettling. What if the Nephilim were not just dangerous in the past? What if the real danger is the possibility that their story is not fully over? Because if even a small part of that ancient world survived, if even a fragment of that bloodline continued, then the question is no longer about history. It becomes about the present. There are theories, controversial, often dismissed, that suggest the Nephilim bloodline may not have completely vanished, that traces of it could have carried through generations, hidden, diluted, but still present. Now, whether those ideas are symbolic, misunderstood, or something else entirely, they point to one thing: the story of the Nephilim refuses to disappear. And that alone is strange, because most ancient myths fade over time. They lose relevance. They become stories of the past. But the idea of giants, the idea of powerful beings who once walked the earth, the idea that something existed before our current civilization, that idea persists across cultures, across time, across history. Why? Because at the center of it, there is a question that has never been fully answered. What if humanity is not the first version of civilization to exist on this planet? What if there was a world before ours, a world that rose, became unstable, and was erased? And what if the Nephilim were part of that world? Not just as giants, but as a force that shaped it, and ultimately helped bring about its collapse. If that were true, then their story is not just about the past. It's a warning. Because everything that made the Nephilim dangerous, their power, their knowledge, their influence over humanity, those same elements exist today in different forms, at a different scale, but still present. And history has shown something very important. When power grows too fast, when knowledge is used without balance, when systems are pushed beyond their limits, collapse follows. So maybe the real question isn't just, what made the Nephilim so dangerous? Maybe the real question is, could the same conditions that made them dangerous happen again? Because if the past holds any truth at all, then the story of the Nephilim is not just a mystery. It's a pattern, one that may have already happened once, and one that, under the right conditions, could happen again.